It's time to begin.
Perfect. That's my mark, right, Richard? Always my mark. Okay, so hi everyone. Good morning, good evening, whatever. My name is Billy, and I'm not going to spend time introducing myself. I mean, just go look up our website, the D3 Lab website. You can see a lot of context for the kind of work that we do. Vivek gave me only 40 minutes, which is not much, to cover a series of experimental designs that you can consider using for optimizing and developing mobile health interventions. And usually I get about 90 minutes in the mHealth Institute to go over these experimental designs. So doing this in 40 minutes is going to be somewhat challenging, but I think it's doable. So we're just going to cut straight to the business. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a framework that I'm working on to connect the dots between 4 types of experimental designs. The first one here, do you see my marker? Do you see it? Okay, so the first one is, here I'm talking about standard randomized trials. And these include standard randomized control trials comparing an intervention to control, or 2-arm trials, or standard multi-arm trials. So basically just the standard randomized trials that we're all familiar with. The second here are factorial designs. The third are SMART designs, and SMART stands for sequential multiple assignment randomized trial. And the fourth are micro-randomized trials, MRTs. So what I'm going to show you is a framework that includes 5 key questions that we need to ask ourselves, that I think we need to ask ourselves as investigators in the process of developing an intervention that builds on mobile health in order to decide which design to use. And of course, I realize that there are other designs that you can consider, but here we're just going to focus on these 4, which is plenty, believe me. Now, what I'll do in the next 40 minutes is I'll go over each one of these 5 questions, 1 through 5, and I'll show you examples where the answer to each question is no. I'm always going to start with the no, and then an example where the answer is yes. So you can see how different answers to these questions can lead you to choose a different experimental design. We ready to go? You can't even nod your head. I can't even see you, but let's assume that we're ready to go. So the first question that we need to ask ourselves is, are we interested in developing an intervention that includes multiple components? So what do I mean by a component? A component is pretty much any aspect of the intervention that you can separate for investigation. So for example, the content can be a component, the intensity of the intervention can be a component, the modality that you're using to deliver the intervention can be a component, and all kinds of features that you use to promote compliance or adherence, and also different tactics that you consider can be components. Now, the reality is that many mobile health interventions include multiple components. But first, I want to show you an example where the answer to the question is no. You see, sometimes we are interested in developing an intervention that includes a single component. This happens a lot in biomedical research when investigators are interested in developing a new tool or a new medication. And what they want to do is they want to compare the effectiveness of this new medication to a standard of care or another type of medication. So in this case, what we would consider is a standard randomized control trial. This example, the second example, is more tricky. And by the way, it happens a lot in mobile health interventions. This is a setting where you have an intervention with multiple elements, but these elements are connected, so you cannot disentangle them for investigation, right? So this is an example from my own research. I was developing an intervention that included phone coaching and text messages, and I wanted to disentangle them for investigation, but I couldn't because I needed the text messages in order to get people to engage with the phone coaching. So I couldn't separate them out. But what I can do is I can conduct a trial to figure out if this intervention package with the multiple elements is better than some control, another intervention or standard of care. So in this case, what I would consider is a standard randomized control trial. All right, but now let me show you an example where the answer to the question is yes. We're interested in developing an intervention with multiple components. This is an example that is based on the work of Bonnie Spring, who you've met already. And in this study, Bonnie wanted to develop a technology-based intervention for weight loss. And in this process, she realized that she has 5 key components that she can separate out for investigation. They included telephone coaching, report to primary care provider about progress, text messages, meal replacement, and body training. So here, the answer to question number 1 will be yes, which leads us to question number 2. And here in question number 2, we need to ask ourselves, do we have scientific questions about the selection of intervention components, right? Sometimes we don't, because sometimes we have all the empirical evidence that is necessary to put together a high quality intervention package. Let's assume that Bonnie knew that all 5 components should be included in the intervention package, right? Then all she needs to do is take this intervention package with all 5 components and confirm its effectiveness compared to control. So this is where the answer no to question number 2 would lead us to choose a standard randomized control trial. But sometimes we do have open scientific questions about the selection of components. For example, what if I don't know if I should include text messages in my intervention, and I don't know if I should include meal replacement in my intervention? These are questions about the selection of components. So here I would answer yes to question number 2, and I would move to question number 3. And here I need to ask myself, do I have scientific questions about more than a single component? Right? Sometimes I don't. Sometimes I have questions about a single component. Let's say that all I want to know is whether text messages should be included in my intervention or not. Right? So in this case, what I would do is I would take the intervention with text messages and I will compare it to an intervention without text messages, because I want to know if it's worthwhile to add text messages to the package. Right? So here, notice that again, I will consider a 2-arm trial. That's it. So answering no would lead us to choose standard randomized trials. Okay, but sometimes I have scientific questions about more than a single component, like here. Here I have scientific questions about 2 components, right? Should I include text messages and should I include meal replacement? And this is where the answer to question number 3 would be yes, which would lead us to question number 4. I think that questions number 1 to 3 are pretty simple, and question number 4 are a bit tricky, because here we need to ask ourselves, do we have scientific questions about the timing of intervention components? So what do I mean by questions about timing? Questions about timing are not only questions about how to intervene, they're also questions about when to intervene. When is it best to deliver a particular component, and which component works best at different points in time, right? Sometimes we don't have questions about the timing of interventions like here. Here, these questions are only about how to intervene. Should we include text messages? Should we include meal replacement? These questions are not about when to intervene, right? And here, we would answer no to question number 4, which would lead us to consider a factorial design. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about factorial designs. Factorial designs, I think most of us are familiar with these types of trials. They are just randomized trials. They involve random assignment of participants through intervention conditions. But they're special because they include more than a single factor. When you use factorial designs to develop interventions, each factor that you consider would correspond to a scientific question that you have about the selection of intervention components. Each factor would typically have 2 levels, and the levels of each factor would be crossed with the levels of the other factors to form a design with multiple experimental conditions. So the best example is the simplest example of a 2x2 factorial design. Remember these scientific questions. We want to know whether we should include text messages in our intervention and whether we should include meal replacement. To answer both questions, we will have 2 factors, 1 for each component. And each factor will have 2 levels, on and off. On when participants will receive the component, and off when they don't. So now what I do is I take the 2 levels of factor 1 and I cross them with the 2 levels of factor 2. And this will give me a design with 4 experimental conditions. right? So you're probably familiar with this 2x2 design. Condition number 1, participants get both components. Condition number 2, only text messages. Condition number 3, only meal replacement. Condition number 4, nothing. Now I want you to assume that we can conduct a trial with 400 participants, right? So what do? Naturally, I will randomly assign these participants with equal probability into these 4 experimental conditions. So I would have 100 participants in each condition. Now let's assume that I conducted this trial and I collected the data, and my outcome is weight loss at the end of the program. The question is, how do I use the data to answer both scientific questions simultaneously? And the answer is by estimating main effects. So what is a main effect? A main effect is the effect of each factor averaging over the levels of the other factors. So for example, to answer question number 1, should we include text messages in our intervention? I will estimate the main effect of factor 1 by pulling outcome information across the 2 conditions in which participants got text messages, and I will compare it to the 2 conditions in which they did not. I want you to notice that this is a comparison of half of my sample versus the other half, just like in a 2-arm trial, right? 2-arm comparison. All right, to answer question number 2 about meal replacement, I will estimate the main effect of meal replacement, the main effect of factor 1, by pulling outcome information across the 2 conditions in which participants got meal replacement, you see 1 and 3, and I'll compare it to the 2 conditions in which they did not, conditions 2 and 4. Again, I want you to notice that this is a comparison of half of my sample versus the other half, just like a 2-arm comparison. All right, but let's make things a bit more complicated. Let's assume that now I have a 3rd scientific question about a 3rd factor. Should I include body training or not? So now what I can do is I can add a 3rd factor, right, for body training. Again, it will have 2 levels, on and off. On when participants will get the component, and off when they don't. So now I can conduct a 2x2x2 factorial design where I cross the 2 levels of text messages with the 2 levels of meal replacement, with the 2 levels of body training, and this will give me a design with 8 experimental conditions, 2x2x2. All right. Looks more complicated, but actually not so much when it comes to actually answering the scientific questions. Let's assume again that I can conduct this trial with 400 participants. So what I'll do is I'll randomly assign with equal probability my participants into each one of these cells, which will give me 50 participants in each cell. And let's assume again that I conducted this trial and collected the data. I have the same outcome, weight loss at the end of the program. Again, how do I answer all 3 scientific questions simultaneously? The answer is by estimating main effects, all right? To answer scientific question number 1 about text messages, again, I will pull outcome information across the conditions in which participants got text messages. Now these are 4 conditions, but it comes down to 200 participants. Right? Half of my sample, and I'll compare it to the other half in which participants did not receive text messages. All right, again, it's a comparison of half of the sample versus the other half. Second question will be answered by comparing half of the sample who got meal replacement to the other half who did not, and question number 3 can be answered by comparing half of the sample who got body training to the other half who did not. Right? So again, a comparison of 200 participants versus 200 participants. So what was going on here? Look at this 2x2, right? And I want you to notice that despite the fact that in the 2x2x2 design, the 8 condition design, although I was trying to answer 3 scientific questions as opposed to 2 in the 2x2, despite the fact that here in a more complex design, I have 8 experimental conditions as opposed to 4. And despite the fact that I have fewer participants in each condition, 50 compared to 100, all else being equal, I'm not losing power for answering my scientific questions. right? Answering scientific questions about the selection of components will still be based on comparing 200 participants to 200 participants. The reason this is happening is because of what is called the recycling feature of factorial designs. What does it mean, the recycling feature? It means that outcome data from the same participant is being used and reused to answer multiple scientific questions. Think about a standard RCT, a standard randomized controlled trial, comparing an intervention to control. In that kind of trial, data from each participant is being used to answer a single scientific question about whether the intervention package is better than control. In the 2x2 design, I want you to notice that outcome data from the same participant, say a participant in condition number 1 who got everything, outcome data from this participant was used and reused to answer 2 scientific questions about 2 components. Here in the 2x2x2, outcome data from the same participant, say a participant in condition number 1, this participant contributed data that was used to answer 3 scientific questions about 3 different components, right? And this is why factorial designs are so efficient when it comes down to answering scientific questions about the selection of multiple components into an intervention package. All right, so these are some useful resources to those of you who are interested in learning more about factorial designs. And now I want to move to an example where the answer to question number 4 is yes. I have scientific questions about the timing of intervention components. And to do that, I want to go back to another example from Bonnie Spring's study, where again, the goal was to develop an intervention to support weight loss. And this intervention was supposed to use technology to facilitate weight loss. But this study is different, and this is a simplified version of a more complicated study. But let's assume that what we want to do is start with minimal technology-based support. You see, the first thing that I want to do for participants is give them a technology-based component that involves low cost and low effort, relatively low cost and low effort. And then I want to identify people who are not losing sufficient amount of weight by week 2, classify them as non-responders, and give them more support. And if people are doing okay, they're losing sufficient amount of weight, they can just continue with the same initial intervention. That's what we want to do. Why do we want to do that? Because we have empirical evidence from Bonnie's prior studies indicating that if overweight and obese adults, if they don't lose sufficient amount of weight by week 2, when they are provided minimal technology-based support initially, when they don't lose sufficient amount of weight by week 2, they're highly likely to fail to achieve the ultimate goal of the intervention, which is 5% weight loss by month 12. And because of that, because we don't want people to fail, we want to identify them early, classify them as non-responders, and give them more support. Whereas responders, they do okay, right? If it's not broken, don't fix it. They can just continue with the same initial intervention. All right, that's the motivation. But let's assume that I have 2 scientific questions. One is how to initiate this intervention. What type of minimal support to provide initially? Text messages or phone coaching? And I also have a question about how to address the needs of non-responders at week 2. Should I provide body training or phone coaching? What I want you to notice here is that we have scientific questions not only about how to intervene, it's not only about which component to deliver, it's also about when to deliver these components, which component works best at different points in time. And this is why we have scientific questions about intervention timing, and we answer yes to question 4, and we move to question 5. Now, question 5 is also kind of tricky, because here we need to ask ourselves, are the components in the intervention that we want to design, are they intended to address conditions that change relatively slowly or rapidly? So let me show you an example where the answer is slowly. Remember this? You just saw this slide, right? Here, we are trying to address conditions that change relatively slowly. By slowly, I mean over a few weeks or months or years. I want you to notice that here, we are trying to address conditions that unfold over 2 weeks, right? we're trying to address early signs of non-response to minimal support, which unfolds over 2 weeks. Over 2 weeks, we can know whether or not the person is likely to fail ultimately. That's why we provide more support, right? So here, this is an example where we're trying to address conditions that unfold relatively slowly, but what I want you to notice is that we're trying to address these conditions by using adaptation, right? What is adaptation? Adaptation is the use of ongoing information about people to decide whether and how to intervene. And here we are providing more support to non-responders because we're trying to address early non-response to an intervention, which unfolds over 2 weeks. I know I sound like a broken record, but this is important, okay? Adaptation can be operationalized by using decision rules. And this decision rule describes the adaptation here in this decision tree. It's just a different way to describe the adaptation, and soon you'll see why. It's kind of like convenient. If the participant is a non-responder, we provide more support. Otherwise, we continue. Now, it's convenient because it also shows you what are the elements of the adaptation. The first element of the adaptation is the tailoring variable. Tailoring variables are information about the person that we use to decide whether and how to intervene. And here, the tailoring variable is the participant's response status. We use information about early response status to decide whether to deliver more support or continue. The second element are the intervention options. These are different components that you consider, right? Different intensities, different content, different modalities, different tactics. Here, there are 2 different tactics that we consider: provide more support or continue. The third element are the thresholds or the levels of the tailoring variable that differentiate between conditions in which we need to provide one component versus another. You see the no and yes here. These are the levels of the tailoring variable response status, which differentiate between conditions in which we need to provide more support versus continue. All right, so when people talk about the adaptation process, that's exactly what they mean. And it's a process where you monitor people continuously to measure the tailoring variable, right? And then you use thresholds or levels of the tailoring variables to decide which component to deliver. And then you deliver the recommended intervention components, right? So that's the adaptation process. The adaptation process is triggered at decision points. Decision points are points in time in which we need to decide whether and how to intervene. Here, there's a decision point in week 2. Why? Because this adaptation process is designed to address conditions that unfold over 2 weeks. After 2 weeks, I'll be able to know whether or not the person is showing early signs of non-response and requires more intervention, right? This is why there's a decision point at week 2. And the adaptation process is guided by the need to achieve 2 types of outcomes: proximal outcomes and a distal outcome. The distal outcome is the ultimate goal the intervention is intended to achieve. That's your end game, right? Here, it's 5% weight loss by month 12. But to achieve this distal outcome here, the adaptation process is designed to address proximal outcomes. Here, one of the proximal outcomes is ongoing weight loss in the course of the program. Now, I want you to notice what is going on here. If the person shows early signs of non-response, if they're not losing sufficient amount of weight, we want to give them more support. Why? Because by giving them more support, we encourage them to lose more weight in the course of the program. And by encouraging them to lose more weight in the course of the program, we'll be able to achieve the distal outcome, which is 5% weight loss by month 12. So you can think about the proximal outcomes as mechanisms of change, as pathways through which the adaptation process, the decision rule, can help you achieve the distal outcome. All right, so these are the 5 elements of what we call standard adaptive interventions. Standard adaptive interventions are interventions that include an adaptation process that is designed to address conditions that change relatively slowly, meaning over a few weeks or a few months. But the question is, why do we need the adaptation, right? What's the point of all this? And there are many reasons why we should adapt interventions, but I want to focus on two primary reasons. The first is that there's high heterogeneity in response to pretty much any given treatment. And what do I mean by heterogeneity? I mean that the treatment that works for me may not work for feedback. And the treatment that works for me now may not work for me in the future. And in many cases, as in the current case, it is possible to identify early those participants, those people who are likely to fail to benefit from the intervention ultimately. Those are likely to be ultimate non-responders. Here, we can identify them as early as week 2. By week 2, we can know with how high degree of certainty that a person is highly likely to fail ultimately if they're not losing sufficient amount of weight. And if we know that they're highly likely to fail ultimately at week 2, then we should do something about it. Give them more support. But if they're doing okay, we should just leave them alone. If it's not broken, don't fix it, right? So the key motivation for many adaptive interventions is the need to address early signs of non-response so we can prevent ultimate failure, so we can increase the number of people that benefit at the end of the program, right? The second issue has to do with cost. Now, I think one of the biggest misconceptions about mobile health interventions is that they're cheap. But we know that's not the case. Some components can be more expensive than others. And sometimes it seems like the most expensive components are the most effective ones. And if that's the case, then we have a huge problem in terms of scalability, our ability to ensure that the majority of the population can benefit from the interventions that we develop, right? And this is why it makes sense to adopt what is called a stepped care approach to treatment. So I don't know if you've heard the term stepped care interventions, but stepped care interventions are simply adaptive interventions that start with minimal support with the least expensive or intense intervention component, and then identifies people who are not doing so well on minimal support and provides more costly and intense components, but only to those who need it most. Whereas participants who are doing okay with minimal support can just continue with the same initial intervention, or you can even tone down the intensity and the cost of the component, right? So the motivation here is to step up and down the cost and the intensity of intervention components, so ultimately we can achieve a more cost-effective and scalable intervention. All right, so this is all nice and easy, but remember, we still have scientific questions about the selection of components and their timing. So here the answer to question number 5 is slowly, which leads us to consider a SMART. All right, so what is a SMART? A SMART is just a randomized trial, but it's special because it includes multiple stages of randomizations. Multiple stages means that the same participant can get randomized more than once in the course of the trial. Now, in a SMART, each stage of randomizations corresponds to a scientific question that you have about the selection and adaptation of intervention components at a particular decision point in the intervention, the adaptive intervention that you're trying to develop. So let's make it concrete. Remember these two scientific questions? We don't know how they intervene at week 0, and we don't know how they intervene at week 2 among non-responders. So what do? We can randomize participants initially to the 2 components, either phone coaching or text messages. Notice, instead of delivering a particular intervention at week 0, we're randomizing to either phone coaching or text messages. Why? Because we don't know how to intervene. That's why we randomize, right? So the randomizations are tied to your scientific questions. And this randomization is tied to the first scientific question, which component to offer first. Then I can identify my non-responders and I can re-randomize them to either phone coaching or body training. Why do I do that? Because I have a second scientific questions about how to address the needs of non-responders in week 2 by phone coaching or body training. That's why we randomize. Now, responders, they can continue with the same initial intervention, and we're not randomizing them. Why? Because we didn't specify any scientific questions about how to intervene for responders. We assume that if people are responding, they would do well by continuing with the same initial intervention. By the way, if we had scientific questions about how to address the needs of responders, we could have randomized responders as well, right? But we didn't. I'm doing this because I want you to see that the randomizations are not there to make the design complicated. They're there to help us answer specific scientific questions. All right. Let's assume again that I can conduct a trial with 400 participants and that the rate of non-response is 50%. This is how participants will be distributed across the 6 cells of the SMART study. Now let's assume again that I conducted the trial, collected the data, the outcome is weight loss at month 12. The question is again, how do I use the data to answer both scientific questions simultaneously? And the answer again is by estimating main effects. To answer question number 1, should I start with phone coaching or text messages? I'm going to pull outcome information across the 3 conditions in which participants got phone coaching, and I'll compare it to the 3 conditions in which they got text messages. Notice this is a comparison of half of my sample versus the other half. This is the main effect of the first stage intervention components, averaging over second stage components for responders and non-responders. The second question, what to do for non-responders, can be answered by pulling outcome data across the 2 conditions in which non-responders got phone coaching, condition number 2 and 5, and we compare it to the 2 conditions in which non-responders received body training, condition 3 and 6. This is a comparison of half of my non-responders versus the other half. Right? This is the main effect of the second stage component among non-responders, averaging over first stage intervention components. All right, data from SMARTs can also help us answer all kinds of other really cool scientific questions about how to build adaptive interventions. And if you're interested in learning more about them, these are a few useful resources. But now I want to show you an example where the answer to question number 5 is rapidly. This is, again, an example that is based on the work of Bonnie Spring and a huge team of researchers at MD2K. Again, all the examples here are simplified examples for illustrative purposes. And this is an illustrative example based on Sense to Stop. Sense to Stop is an intervention that is intended to provide smoking cessation support. It's based on evidence indicating that if smokers attempting to quit experience stress, that stress episode is likely to lead to a slip, an isolated smoking episode, or a lapse. And that lapse is likely to lead to a full relapse, which we don't want. And this is why in Sense to Stop, participants are wearing a collection of sensors. The sensors monitor people's physiology continuously. There's an algorithm on the phone that takes this data and uses it to classify every given minute as either stress or no stress. And if stress is detected, the phone lights up and it recommends that the person will engage in a stress regulation activity, one of 3 mindfulness-based activities that take about 5 to 10 minutes to complete on the person's mobile device. All right, what I want you to notice is that there's an adaptation process in this intervention, right? Because if stress is yes, we provide a prompt. Otherwise, we do nothing. So our tailoring variable is stress. We use information about stress to decide whether we should deliver a prompt or not. The 2 intervention options are deliver a prompt or do nothing. Yes and no are the levels of the tailoring variable stress that differentiate between conditions in which we should deliver a prompt versus do nothing. So we have an adaptation process here. This adaptation process is triggered every minute. Why? Because every minute the person can transition from experiencing no stress to experiencing stress, right? And we're trying to address conditions that change rapidly. Stress can change rapidly. That's why we have a decision point every minute. Compare that to the weight loss intervention where we have decision points at week 0 and at week 2 because we're trying to address conditions that unfold over 2 years. I just want you to see the difference between addressing conditions that change rapidly versus slowly by using adaptations. And of course, here as well, the adaptation process is designed to address proximal outcomes that can help us achieve a distal outcome. Here, the distal outcome is smoking cessation. But to achieve this distal outcome, the adaptation process is designed to address proximal outcomes like reducing the probability of a lapse in the next 2 hours. I want you to notice what's happening here. We are delivering an intervention when people are experiencing stress. Why? Because stress represents a state of vulnerability for a lapse, a state of risk in terms of the adverse proximal outcome, right? We deliver a prompt, we deliver support because we want to break the link between a state of vulnerability and the proximal outcome. We want to do that because by preventing the proximal outcome, by preventing a lapse, we'll be able to achieve the distal outcome, which is smoking cessation. So again, I want you to notice that the proximal outcome is a mechanism of change through which the adaptation process can help us achieve the distal outcome. All right, so some of you must be looking at this slide thinking, that's exactly the same slide that she showed us before when she was talking about standard adaptive interventions, right? So she just had this, cut and paste thingy. And if you notice that, then you're right. I did cut and paste. This is exactly the same slide that I showed you before when talking about adaptive interventions. But the reason I'm showing you this is because this is an adaptive intervention, but it's a special case of adaptive intervention where the adaptation process is designed to address conditions that change rapidly as opposed to slowly. And when you have an intervention, or when you want to develop an intervention in which the adaptation process is trying to address conditions that change rapidly, you can call this intervention a just-in-time adaptive intervention, or a JEDI. Now, what I want you to keep in mind about JEDIs, those of you who are interested in building those, is that JEDIs can address conditions that represent states of risk or vulnerability in terms of an adverse proximal outcome like stress in the example that I showed you, but they can also be used to leverage moments or windows of opportunity for positive changes as they occur in people's natural environment. For example, if I walk by a park, it's an opportunity to prompt me to engage me in physical activity, to engage me in walking, okay? I just don't want us to think about JEDIs just as interventions that are supposed to address risk. They can also capitalize on windows of opportunity for positive changes. All right, but why do we need adaptation? I think the primary reason why we need adaptation when we're trying to address conditions that change rapidly is because we need to minimize unnecessary treatment and burden. So these two things are connected, but they're quite different, right? The reason why we need to do this is because the conditions that we're trying to address are likely to change pretty much anywhere in daily life in the person's natural environment. And in the person's natural environment, we know that multiple demands can compete for time and effort and attention. This is why we need to minimize unnecessary treatment by delivering an intervention only when it is needed. For example, only when the person experiences a state of vulnerability. Otherwise, we should leave the person alone. And we also need adaptation in order to deliver an intervention, not only when vulnerability happens or when there's an opportunity for positive changes, but also only when the person is receptive to the kind of intervention that we want to deliver. And by receptivity, I mean that the person is willing and able to invest effort in the intervention that you deliver, right? So for example, in Sense to Stop, of course, we're not delivering an intervention every time the person experiences stress. We deliver an intervention if the person experiences stress and the person did not receive an intervention in the past 60 minutes and the person is not driving a car. We're delivering an intervention when the person is vulnerable and receptive, right? That's what we need the adaptation. So I want you to stare at this slide for a second because I'm going to go back to it. You see, every minute, if the person is stressed and receptive, we deliver a prompt encouraging the person to engage in a mindfulness exercise that takes about 5 to 10 minutes to complete. Okay, and I want you to stare at the slide because the reality is that in many cases, we don't know how to intervene when people are stressed and receptive. We don't know how to intervene in the moment. And we have open scientific questions about the selection and adaptation of components in a setting where we're trying to address conditions that change rapidly. For example, here the scientific question is, what type of prompt should we deliver when people are stressed and receptive? Should we give them the prompt to engage them in 5 to 10 minute exercises, which can be pretty burdensome, especially delivered in real time, right, in the natural environment? Or maybe we should deliver a prompt that is less effortful, a recommendation to engage in a less effortful activity like take a walk, chew a gum, take a deep breath and count to 3, right? Here we have scientific questions about the selection of components in a setting where we're trying to address conditions that change rapidly. And this is where we can consider micro-randomized trials. Okay, so what are micro-randomized trials or MRTs? Again, they are just randomized trials. That's all they are. But again, they're special because they include sequential randomization. Just like a SMART, in a micro-randomized trial, the same participant can get randomized multiple times in the course of the trial. But micro-randomized trials are different from SMARTs because the same participant can get randomized multiple times a day, hundreds and thousands of times in the course of the trial. And the reason we need this, the reason we need to micro-randomize so rapidly is because we're trying to answer questions about the selection and adaptation of intervention components in a setting where we're trying to address conditions that change rapidly. We're trying to develop a JEDI, just-in-time adaptive intervention. And in a JEDI, we can have decision points every given minute, because every given minute, the person can transition from experiencing no stress to stress. But we don't know how to intervene at each of these minutes, right? Should we deliver high effort prompt or low effort prompt? If we don't know how to intervene, we can randomize. See, so instead of delivering a particular intervention when people are stressed and receptive, we can randomize to different types of prompts. And this is why in MRTs, participants can get randomized hundreds and thousands of times in the course of the trial, multiple times a day, right? And the data here can help us answer really cool scientific questions about the selection and adaptation of components in a JEDI. For example, when people are stressed and receptive, on average, is it better to deliver a high effort prompt or a low effort prompt in terms of reducing the probability of a lapse? And under what conditions one type of prompt would be better than another, right? MRTs can also help us answer all kinds of other really cool scientific questions about the selection of components and adaptation in JEDIs. These are, again, a few useful resources that you can start with. And to summarize, I think the most important thing for you to keep in mind if you decide to use this framework is that we have to start with specifying the kind of intervention that we want to develop and our scientific questions. And this is important because sometimes, myself included, people get excited about a design and they start by specifying the kind of design that they want to use, and then they're trying to match the scientific questions that would justify using this design. But I keep saying it to myself, and I'm saying this to you, this is not good scientific practice. Good scientific practice is to start with specifying the kind of intervention that we want to develop and open scientific questions that we need to address. If you're interested in connecting with experts in the field, this is just a list of my own collaborators who taught me everything that I know about these designs, and I'm super grateful for their guidance. And this is it. I think I was right on time. I hope so, because yeah, very close. Okay, I think we have a few minutes for questions, right?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Do you want to unmute? Do you want me to look at the chat? How do you want to go about it?
They can speak to you. They're all live.
Just talk to me. I'm not going to bite. I'm too far away.
Hi, can I jump in with a question?
Go ahead.
Great presentation, very helpful. Thank you so much. My question is about power calculation. I mean, I think, you raised a great point about, different arms, but, in the field, we always have the challenge of sample size. I do community-based research, so recruitment is always challenging. So I just want to get your thoughts when we think about this design and then power calculation and a small size effect and small samples.
Yeah, so that's a really good point. And this is interesting, because I think the first trial that I learned about of these of the three MRTs, Factorial Designs and SMARTs, was the Factorial Design. That was the first thing that I learned. And that's the first thing that I was thinking about. I was like, what? Power? Seriously, you can have, Factorial Designs with 16 cells. How do you power something like that? You're never going to have power for comparing individual conditions, right? But I want to show you something really interesting. And this is why I keep saying we got to start with our scientific questions. We always have to lay them out. So let me go back to this. Okay, so look at this 2 by 2 by 2, right? If you're thinking about comparing, for example, condition number 1 to condition number 8, right? Everything on versus everything off. It's an interesting scientific question, right? But the comparison would be based on comparing 50 participants versus 50 participants, right? So the first thing that I was thinking is I'll never have power for that, right? But at the same time, I had to go back and remind myself, what was the scientific question motivating me to plan this trial? And the scientific question had nothing to do with comparing individual cells. It wasn't about comparing the full package compared to control, everything on versus everything off. If your primary scientific question is compare the full package to control, everything on versus everything off, the most efficient design for you would be a standard randomized control trial comparing the full package to control. But if you're interested in answering questions about the selection of components, remember, each question was based on comparing half of the sample versus the other half. You would size it just in the same way that you size a 2-arm trial, right? So in terms of power, it's no different. I mean, of course, it depends on the effect size, and so on, right? But conceptually, when you think about the number of participants that you compare, it's no different from a randomized controlled trial comparing half of your sample versus the other half. But the advantage here is that you can answer more scientific questions using the same sample size. And I think this is the key advantage when it comes to answering questions about selecting components, right? So that's why I think my experience so far, and I've designed a few, I would say a bunch of smart designs and factorial designs, is that the sample size, the range of sample sizes that we use are no different from the range of sample sizes that I use for standard RCT, right? And it's just, I don't know if it fully answers your question because the issue of power is complicated, but just to give you the, the intuition for it.
Thank you. This is helpful. I appreciate it.
I would love to ask a question also, and it's a bit related because in some ways, could you show that slide where you were having the phone and buddy and where you were dividing them by, I think it was the smart one.
Smart.
And to me, it's sort of like, especially for behavioral interventions, when a person gets one type of behavioral intervention, even if they don't completely respond to it, it's still changing maybe something. And to me, like for your comparison of afterwards, if I'm comparing the addition of the phone versus buddy, I still think there's some difference between a person that started with the phone to the text and you're ignoring that. Because you're basically, and
I'm not ignoring that. You see, I'm actually controlling for it by design. So let's start with
not
that.
completely, because your comparison is going to be all of the 50 versus 50, like the 100 versus 100.
Yeah, so that's one scientific question. One scientific question is about the main effect. On average, regardless of what you did initially, controlling by design for what you did initially, is it better to provide one type of component versus another? But just so you know, another scientific question can be, is there an interaction, right? And by the way, I always test interactions, talking about myself, putting the scientist hat, not the methodologist hat. I always test an interaction between the second stage components and the first stage components. I'm very interested to see if the effect of the phone coaching versus body training would vary depending on what I gave people initially, right?
Yeah,
but that's a different scientific question.
Yeah, and then I'm concerned about the sample size.
Yeah, so, I agree with you. So here's the thing. With sample size, of course, interactions, the effect size is usually smaller compared to main effects. And I'm talking about both the factorial designs and smart designs. So I agree with you. I would also be concerned about power for detecting interactions, but usually the questions about interactions for me are more exploratory questions rather than, primary aim questions. The primary aim questions would be about main effects, right? These are questions about the average effect, averaging over other components. But then I'm interested in interactions with the first stage intervention options. I'm interested in interactions, with baseline variables and also with time varying variables, right? For example, adherence, is there a different effect for second stage options depending on whether people adhere to the initial intervention, right? So these would be my exploratory aims or exploratory questions. And usually we are not sizing, we're not planning sample size for exploratory aims, but for main effects, for primary aims.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions?
I had a very quick question, and I apologize if you already answered it, but or you said it in your talk, but I missed. How do you know if the participants were receptive? Are you using the same? Are you measuring stress? So I missed that part.
Yeah. So the receptivity and sense to stop was operationalized in terms of whether you received an intervention in the past 60 minutes and if you were driving a car. So you are receptive if you're not driving a car. Wait, I'll find it. Yeah. So you are receptive if you're not driving a car and if you did not receive an intervention in the past 60 minutes.
I see. Okay, thanks.
But it's just, if you ask me, it's a minimal bar. It's a relatively minimal bar. I mean, there's a lot that we still need to figure out about when people are receptive to an intervention. Yeah.
Billy, we will